The laughter broke out before Leticia could even understand what was happening. Sharp and loud around the polished table, echoing against the glass walls of the boardroom, as if the moment had been rehearsed. And she stood there, frozen for half a second, still holding the cleaning bucket at her side. Her uniform suddenly feeling heavier under the cold white lights, while every pair of eyes in the room locked onto her like she didn't belong in the same air as them. Ricardo leaned back in his chair at the head of the table, a slow smirk stretching across his face as he lifted a printed document between two fingers, waving it slightly like it was nothing more than a prop in a joke only he fully controlled. "Hey!" he said, his voice cutting through the noise with casual authority, the kind that didn't need to raise itself to be obeyed. "You! Come here." A few more chuckles followed, quieter this time, more focused, as Leticia hesitated just a fraction before stepping forward. The soft sound of her shoes against the floor somehow louder than everything else in that moment. Her eyes briefly scanning the faces around the table, executives in tailored suits, expensive watches catching the light, expressions ranging from amused to openly mocking. Ricardo placed the document flat on the table and tapped it twice with his finger, his gaze never leaving her. "Translate this," he said, almost bored. "If you get it right." He paused, exchanging a glance with one of the men beside him, who was already grinning. "I'll make you a director." The room burst again, louder now, the kind of laughter that didn't expect an answer, that fed on the assumption that there wouldn't be one. And Leticia felt it hit her all at once, the weight of it, the intention behind it, the certainty that whatever she did next had already been decided for her in their minds. She didn't laugh, she didn't look down either. Instead, she stepped closer to the table, slowly, deliberately, setting the bucket aside without breaking eye contact, her fingers brushing against the edge of the paper as the laughter started to fade, not because they chose to stop, but because something in the way she moved didn't match what they expected. Ricardo watched her, the smirk still there, but thinner now. "Well," he said. Leticia picked up the document, her eyes moving across the lines with quiet focus, the room holding its breath in a way no one acknowledged, and when she finally looked up, her expression hadn't changed. But the atmosphere had. "This isn't what you think it is," she said. The silence that followed didn't come from respect. It came from the first crack in their certainty. The laughter didn't disappear all at once. It faded unevenly, like something that lost its footing without warning, and Leticia could feel it in the way a few voices trailed off mid-sentence, in how chairs stopped shifting, in how the air itself seemed to tighten as her eyes moved calmly across the document instead of reacting the way they expected. Because what had started as a joke was no longer moving in a direction they controlled. Ricardo leaned forward slightly in his chair, the paper still held loosely between his fingers, his smile no longer as relaxed as before. And although he didn't say anything yet, the shift in his posture was enough to pull the attention of the others back to the center of the table, where Leticia now stood without hesitation, reading in silence while the last scattered chuckles died out. "Well," one of the executives muttered under his breath, not loud enough to challenge, but enough to fill the space. Leticia didn't respond immediately, her eyes scanning line after line with quiet precision. And that silence stretched just long enough to make it uncomfortable, long enough for the confidence in the room to begin slipping into something more uncertain, something that didn't match the tone they had started with. Ricardo tapped his fingers once against the table. "Come on," he said, a trace of impatience slipping into his voice. "It's not that complicated." Leticia lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his eyes without flinching. And for the first time since she had walked into that room, the difference between them didn't feel as absolute as it had a moment ago. "It's not complicated," she said. A faint smirk returned to Ricardo's face, quick, reflexive. "Good," he replied. "Then translate it." Leticia lowered the paper just slightly, holding it at chest level, and there was no hesitation in her voice when she spoke again. No defensiveness, no attempt to prove anything, just a calm statement that didn't belong in the scene they had created for her. "It's not what you think it says." The reaction was immediate, subtle but undeniable, a few brows tightening, a glance exchanged across the table, someone shifting in their chair as if adjusting to a new balance they hadn't agreed to. Ricardo's smile didn't disappear, but it thinned. What does that mean? He asked. Leticia turned the document slightly toward him, not handing it over, just enough to indicate a specific section. This clause, she said, her finger stopping on a line halfway down the page, isn't translated correctly. One of the men on the right leaned forward. In what way? He asked, his tone sharper now, curiosity replacing amusement. Leticia didn't look at him. In a way that changes everything. The room went still again, but this time it wasn't driven by mockery. It was driven by attention, the kind that builds slowly and then locks into place when something doesn't add up. And Ricardo felt it too, even if he didn't show it fully, because the control he had assumed a few minutes ago was no longer unquestioned. That's a big statement, he said, his voice measured now. Leticia nodded once. It's a precise one. Ricardo held her gaze for a second longer, then extended his hand. Show me. She stepped closer to the table, placing the document down between them, her movement steady, deliberate, and as the executives leaned in almost at the same time, drawn by something they hadn't expected to need, the dynamic of the room shifted again, quieter this time, but deeper, because the joke had already ended, and something else had taken its place. No one pulled back from the table after that, even though no one had asked them to lean in, because something in the way Leticia had pointed out that single line forced their attention to stay there, anchored to the paper as if the truth had weight, and Ricardo felt it more than anyone else, not just in the silence, but in the shift of energy around him, the kind that doesn't need words to make itself clear. Show me again, he said, his voice lower now, controlled, but no longer casual. Leticia didn't hesitate. She adjusted the document slightly, her finger returning to the same line, steady, precise, as if she had already memorized it. This section, she repeated, her tone calm, almost neutral. It looks standard in English. Ricardo narrowed his eyes. It is standard, he replied. We've used this structure before. Leticia glanced up at him briefly, then back to the paper. Yes, she said, but not like this. The room tightened again, the kind of tension that builds when certainty starts slipping in small, almost invisible cracks, and one of the executives to Ricardo's right shifted forward, his expression sharpening. What are you saying? He asked. Leticia turned the page slightly, revealing a secondary column of text most of them hadn't paid attention to before. There are 3 versions of this contract, she explained. English, German, and French. A faint crease formed between Ricardo's brows. That's normal, he said. International agreements. Not when they don't match, Leticia cut in, not raising her voice, but interrupting just enough to change the rhythm of the conversation. That was the moment it clicked. Not completely, not for everyone, but enough to alter the atmosphere in a way that couldn't be undone, because now they weren't just listening, they were reconsidering. Norman leaned in closer, his eyes scanning the document. Where? He asked. Leticia shifted her hand slightly. Here, she said, tapping once. The German version doesn't say operational support. Ricardo frowned. What does it say? Leticia lifted her gaze again, meeting his eyes directly this time. It says, transfer of operational control. The silence that followed wasn't hesitation anymore. It was impact. Valeria straightened in her chair. That's not a minor difference, she said, her voice tighter now. No, Leticia replied, it isn't. Ricardo took the document from the table without asking, his movements sharper, more deliberate than before. His eyes scanning the text with a focus that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with verification. And as the seconds passed, the room remained still around him, no one daring to interrupt, no one willing to break the moment. This has to be a translation error, one of the men said, though his tone lacked conviction. Leticia shook her head slightly. It's not an error, she said. It's consistent across the German and French versions. Norman looked up. Then it's intentional. The word landed heavier than anything else that had been said so far. Ricardo stopped reading. Slowly, he lowered the document. And for the first time since Leticia had entered that room, there was no trace of amusement left in his expression. Who reviewed this? He asked. The question didn't need to be directed. It moved across the table on its own. And just like that, the problem was no longer theoretical. It was real. The silence didn't break this time with laughter or disbelief. It shifted into something sharper, more deliberate, as if every person at the table suddenly became aware that the problem in front of them couldn't be ignored or laughed away, and that awareness moved quickly, passing from one face to another until it landed exactly where it always does in rooms like that, on the need to find someone responsible. Ricardo didn't sit back down. He stayed standing for a moment longer, the document still in his hand, his eyes scanning the lines again as if repetition might change what he had already understood. But it didn't, and when he finally looked up, his expression had lost the last trace of amusement it once carried. "Who reviewed this before it got here?" he asked. The question didn't rise in volume, but it cut through the room with precision, and no one answered immediately. Not because they didn't hear him, but because they did. And the weight of that question settled in a way that made every movement feel slower, more careful. One of the executives shifted in his chair. "We all saw it," he said too quickly. Ricardo turned his head slightly. "That's not what I asked." The man hesitated, just enough to be noticed. Leticia stood where she was, silent now, watching the shift happen in real time, because this was no longer about translation or contracts. It was about accountability, and she could see it in the way the eyes around the table avoided direct contact, in how fingers tapped against folders without purpose, in how confidence was being replaced by calculation. Norman leaned forward, his voice more controlled than before. "Martinez handled the initial review," he said. All attention moved at once. Martinez straightened, caught in the sudden focus. "I reviewed the English version," he replied, his tone defensive, already anticipating the direction of the conversation. Ricardo took a step closer. "Only the English version?" he asked. "That's the one we operate with," Martinez said. "That's standard." "It's incomplete," Leticia said quietly. The interruption was subtle, but it landed harder than anything else, because it didn't challenge, it corrected. Martinez turned toward her, irritation flashing across his face. "You weren't even part of this process," he said. Leticia met his gaze without reacting to the tone. "No," she replied. "That's why I read all of it." A few heads shifted again, not dramatically, but enough to signal that the ground was moving under them, that what had sounded like a defense a second ago now felt like something weaker, something exposed. Ricardo extended the document toward Martinez. "Read it," he said. Martinez didn't move at first. "I already—" "Read it," Ricardo repeated. This time, he did. The room held still as Martinez's eyes moved across the page, slower than before, more carefully, his expression tightening with each line, and the seconds stretched just enough for everyone else to start seeing it too. Not the words themselves, but the reaction, the subtle collapse of certainty in someone who had walked in confident. "That can't be right," Martinez said under his breath. Leticia didn't respond. Ricardo didn't either, because the answer was already there. Valeria crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on the document. "It is right," she said. The final resistance broke quietly, without argument, without anyone raising their voice, because at that point there was nothing left to defend, only consequences to face. And as Martinez lowered the paper slightly, avoiding everyone's eyes, the responsibility in the room stopped moving. It stayed, right where it belonged. The room didn't explode into chaos, the way situations like that sometimes do. Instead, it tightened, contained, every movement more measured, every word more deliberate, as if everyone present understood that whatever happened next would define not just the deal in front of them, but their position inside it. And Ricardo felt that shift immediately, not as a loss of authority, but as something more dangerous. The realization that authority alone wasn't enough anymore. He straightened slowly, taking the document back from Martinez without asking, his fingers gripping the edge of the paper with controlled tension while his eyes moved across the lines again. Faster this time, sharper, as if he were searching for a mistake that would restore the balance he had lost. But the text didn't change, and neither did the implication behind it. "This doesn't leave this room," he said. The sentence wasn't loud, but it carried weight, and for a moment no one questioned it. because it sounded like control, like leadership, like the version of him they were used to following. But it didn't solve anything. Valeria crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on the document. "That's not the priority right now," she said. "The priority is that we almost signed this." Ricardo didn't look at her immediately. "We didn't sign it," he replied. "Because she stopped it," Valeria answered without hesitation. The air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, as attention moved back toward Leticia, not in mockery this time, not even in surprise, but in something closer to recognition, something that made the dynamic even more unstable. Ricardo finally turned his head toward Leticia, studying her for a second longer than before, as if recalibrating where she fit in the structure he thought he controlled. "You went through the entire document," he said. Leticia didn't nod. "Yes." "How long did it take you?" "A few minutes." A faint crease appeared on Ricardo's forehead. "A few minutes," he repeated. Leticia held his gaze. "It wasn't hidden," she said. "It was ignored." That line landed harder than any accusation. Norman leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. "That's worse," he muttered. Ricardo's jaw tightened. Not at her, but at the implication, at what it said about the room, about the people in it, about himself. And for a brief moment, there was a crack in his composure, not visible to everyone, but enough for the tension to deepen. "We need to verify this across all versions," he said, regaining control through action rather than denial. "We already did," Leticia replied. Ricardo looked back at her. "You did?" "Yes." "With what authority?" The question was sharp, direct, a final attempt to re-establish hierarchy. Leticia didn't hesitate. "With attention!" Silence. Not because they didn't understand, because they did. Valeria looked away for a second, almost smiling under her breath, not out of humor, but recognition, while Norman's expression shifted into something more analytical, more interested than before. Ricardo exhaled slowly, setting the document down on the table. "All right," he said. "Then we assume it's correct?" No one argued. "Which means," he continued, "we don't just have a bad translation." He paused. "We have a compromise deal." That was the moment it fully settled, not as a possibility, not as a concern, but as a fact that changed everything moving forward, and the room absorbed it in silence, each person processing the cost, the risk, the consequence of what had almost happened. Ricardo looked around the table once, then back at Leticia. "And you caught it," he said. It wasn't praise, it wasn't disbelief, it was acknowledgement, and it changed the way everyone else looked at her. The weight of the situation didn't lift after the realization. It settled, heavier, more defined, as if the room itself had accepted that what they were dealing with was no longer a possibility, but a consequence, waiting to be addressed. And Ricardo stood there for a moment, longer than necessary, the document still in his hand, not because he needed more time to understand it, but because he needed to decide what to do with it. He looked around the table slowly, taking in every face, every posture, every subtle reaction that now carried more meaning than before. And for the first time since the meeting had started, he wasn't reading the document. He was reading them. "We don't move forward with this," he said. No one argued. No one. The statement landed with finality, not because it was forceful, but because it aligned with what everyone already knew. And that made it impossible to challenge without exposing something worse. Valeria nodded almost immediately. "That's the only option," she said. Norman leaned back slightly, exhaling. "We need to pull the entire deal," he added, "and reopen negotiations from zero." Ricardo didn't answer right away, but the lack of resistance was answer enough, and as he placed the document flat on the table, the decision became tangible, something real that couldn't be undone with a different interpretation or a delayed reaction. "Whoever drafted this knew exactly what they were doing," Norman continued, his tone sharper now. "This isn't sloppy, it's strategic." Leticia remained silent, not out of hesitation, but because there was nothing left to prove. And that silence, steady and grounded, carried more weight now than any explanation she could have given. Ricardo turned toward her again. "You're certain," he said. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. Yes. No hesitation. No doubt. That single word sealed everything. Ricardo held her gaze for a second longer, measuring something beyond the situation. Something that had shifted without permission, without structure, without hierarchy allowing it, and that shift was uncomfortable, because it couldn't be reversed. "We fix it now," he said, more to the room than to her. Valeria reached for the documents, already organizing them. "I'll contact legal," she said. Norman nodded. "I'll flag the international teams." The room began to move again, but not the way it had before, not with confidence or control, but with urgency, with purpose, with the quiet understanding that they had been closer to a disaster than any of them had realized. Ricardo remained still for a moment longer, then stepped back slightly, giving space where before he would have taken it, and that small movement didn't go unnoticed. Not by Leticia, not by anyone paying attention, because power doesn't always disappear. Sometimes it adjusts. "You stopped this," he said, again not praise, recognition. Leticia didn't react the way they expected someone in her position might have. She didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't accept the moment as something that elevated her, because for her, it wasn't about position. "It shouldn't have needed stopping," she replied. The sentence didn't accuse, it clarified, and that made it harder to ignore. Ricardo didn't respond immediately, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he knew any answer would only confirm what had already been exposed. So instead, he looked back at the table, at the documents, at the point where everything had almost gone wrong. And for the first time, he wasn't in control of the narrative. The room didn't return to normal after the decision, even as people began moving again, gathering papers, making calls, speaking in lower voices as if the volume itself had to adjust to what had just happened, because something had shifted beyond the deal, beyond the documents, something that couldn't be filed away or rewritten, and Leticia could feel it without needing to look directly at anyone. Valeria was the first to step away from the table, already on her phone, speaking quickly, efficiently. Her tone controlled but urgent, while Norman moved in the opposite direction, opening his laptop, sending messages, coordinating what had just become a crisis. And in the middle of that controlled movement, Ricardo remained still for a moment longer, watching the room reorganize itself without him having to direct every step. That was new. He finally exhaled and turned slightly, his eyes landing on Leticia again, not with the dismissive glance from earlier, not with curiosity either, but with something more measured, something that took into account everything that had just unfolded. "You can go," he said. It wasn't harsh, it wasn't kind, it was simply what made sense in the structure they all understood. Leticia nodded once, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, and turned toward where she had left her bucket, picking it up with the same calm she had carried through the entire exchange, as if the beginning and the end of the moment belonged to the same person, even if everything in between had tried to change that. As she started walking toward the door, the movement in the room continued around her. Conversations restarting, decisions being made, roles reasserting themselves, but not quite in the same way as before, because now there was a hesitation underneath it all, a subtle awareness that something had been overlooked, and that it had consequences. "Wait," Ricardo said. She stopped, but didn't turn immediately. When she did, the distance between them felt different, not smaller, not larger, just clearer. Ricardo took a step forward, not enough to close the space, just enough to step out of the position he had occupied at the head of the table. "What you did," he began, then paused briefly as if choosing the exact weight of the words, "wasn't part of your job." Leticia met his eyes. "No. But it prevented a serious loss." She held his gaze without reacting. "It prevented a mistake," she said. Ricardo nodded once, slowly. "Still," he added, "most people in this room didn't see it." There was no pride in her expression, no shift in posture, no attempt to take ownership of the moment beyond what it already was. "They didn't look," she replied. The answer settled between them, simple and exact, leaving no room for reinterpretation. And for a brief second, Ricardo had nothing to counter it with, because it wasn't an argument. It was a fact. "You should consider staying," he said finally, "in a different position." The offer wasn't loud, but it carried weight, not as a reward, but as a correction, an attempt to realign something that had clearly been misjudged. Leticia glanced briefly back at the table, at the documents, at the people who were now too busy to look at her the way they had before, and then returned her attention to him. "I'm already in the right position," she said. It wasn't defiance. It was clarity. Ricardo studied her for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in acceptance of something he hadn't anticipated needing to accept. Leticia turned again and walked out, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the room exactly as it was, except it wasn't. Because the documents on the table hadn't changed. The deal hadn't been signed, the structure of power was still there, but the certainty behind it wasn't.